Good morning, members. I call Committee of the Whole on Bill 23, Anti-Racism Act to order. Shall Clause 1 pass? Recognizing the member from Richmond North Centre.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to ask the Minister through the Chair that could the Minister provide some details on what consultation have taken place prior to the development of this legislation, and which groups, which organizations, and which individuals were engaged during this consultation?
Minister.
Thank you. And before I start, I just want to introduce the people that are with me today. I have Heike Chima, my ADM in the AG's office, and Mariam Okwengu, the executive director, also from the Anti-Racism Division. So this bill actually is based upon one of the most extensive consultation processes, I think, in I'm going to say ever, but I have no way to verify that. But for legislation, it was pretty extensive. So we modeled it a little bit after the Anti-Racism Data Act, but of course the content of this was a bit different. So we gave out 70 grants to organizations, and if the member wants a list, we can provide a list of the organizations. And that was to lead their own consultations and their community engagements to help us understand what should and could be included in an anti-racism piece of legislation. So that resulted in about 5,000 people giving us feedback and the content of helping to frame the content of the bill. We also made it sure that it was across BC, so including rural communities. We did Indigenous specific engagement, which involved not only nation governments but also FNLC and our co-development processes that we always engage when we develop legislation. So that led to the Indigenous specific content of the bill before you. We also did online engagement, which was open to everybody in BC. We did a big launch of that, and we received about 2,000 submissions online. And we, because of the nature of the bill and removing systemic racism within government, we did internal consultations as well within the public service. So those were the areas broadly that we covered, and we have the names of the specific organizations if the member wants them.
Member.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Madam Chair. So the Minister says a $70,000 grant. Is it in total for this consultation?
Attorney General.
So with the specific community engagement, just to put the numbers, it was up to $5,000 that a community group was eligible for that open engagements. And so that was to host and conduct an engagement on the bill. That was the cost.
Member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just want to clarify again. So $5,000 for each group and a total of $70,000 for the consultation.
Attorney General.
Okay, so I think I see maybe, just to provide more clarity, it was 70 organizations that received up to $5,000 for the engagement. So I believe the total that we spent on that portion of the engagement was $300,000. But there were also specific funding that went to the First Nations Leadership Council and to the Modern Treaty Alliance and also Métis Nation. So there was, that was in addition to the $300,000.
Member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the $300,000 is to the 70 organization. That's the racialized community organization. I just want to clarify. And then those engagement with the First Nation, the amount of money is separate in addition to the $300,000.
Attorney General.
Yes, we were very careful when we selected the organizations through the screening process that they represented a diversity of organizations and also geographic diversity across the province. So the list that I can provide the member shows that. And so the $300,000 was for the community grants, and the money that went to First Nations Leadership Council, I think it was $250,000 on top of that because of the nations, the number of nations that are in the province.
Member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Minister. So I would like to, through the chair, have a list of those organizations, but just to ask briefly, so does it cover every racialized community, including the Jewish community organization and the Muslim community organization as well?
Attorney General.
Okay, so I'm happy to provide a list to the member, but I can just point out just some of the organizations that received funding. So it's important to remember that some of these are, their gatherings are interfaith gatherings. So it's multi-faith, including Muslim and Jewish. So it's hard to, they're not specific to that, but they did interfaith. So Foundation for a Path Forward, specifically the Richmond Jewish Day School, Parent Advisory Committee, Voices of Muslim Women Foundation, and then we Engaged Community Canada Society also did interfaith work, and the Progressive Intercultural Community Service Society also did interfaith work. Those are just some of the organizations. There's a long list here, and we'll provide that a copy to the member. Maybe there you go.
Member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just now the Minister said that there's a criteria of geographical representation as well. So how about the racialized community representation? So we are a multicultural community, a multicultural province. So has the Minister's office make sure that every group has a representative organization involved in this 70 organizations so that they can present their point of view about the communities, what kind of racism that particular ethnic community, racialized community is facing?
Attorney General.
Yeah, the team took really great care in making sure that the community organizations were representative not only of the groups in our province, but also geographically, to cover off all voices. So there's a few things that led to that, the development of that, or the protections to make sure that that happens. So one is the criteria that were set out for the grant application. So it was taking into account intersectionality, faith-based groups, and if there was broader scope engagement, then the amount that an organization could get could be increased. Also with the online engagement, it opened it up to everybody. So not only were we doing targeted groups that we knew had a reach in their community that could lead the type of discussions we wanted, and covered it off for different racialized communities to make sure they were represented. We also had public town halls beforehand. So before the grant became public, the team had town halls to explain it to organizations, to say what our intention was with the engagement and how they could apply to help host one. And we tried to do that to make sure we were getting it out to all organizations and all people that represent different groups in the province.
Member?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Minister. So the town halls that the Minister mentioned, so how many town halls were held before the grants were given to this 70 organization, and what geographical areas were those town halls being held?
Attorney General.
So the pre-work was 2 virtual town halls that were held for people, organizations across the province. But we also have, through the work that we did previously with the Anti-Racism Data Act, a network of organizations across the province that are better connected to government through Resilience BC. So we're able to get the word out to not only organizations, but different parts of the province through that network.
Member?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So back to this 70 organizations. So were this 70 organization basically selected by the team working for the Attorney General's anti-racism branch?
Attorney General.
Yeah, it followed our normal granting procedures under the ministry staff.
Member?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I want to ask about the definition of public harm. How was the definition of public harm developed for this act? Was this influenced by models from other jurisdictions?
Attorney General.
Just some clarity from the member. I think she's referring to the definition of community harm. Is that right?
Member?
It was public harms.
Yeah, maybe I could just get some more guidance from the question, because I don't believe that this bill defines public harms, but we do have a community harm in the act. So.
Member?
Sorry, my apologies. Yeah.
Attorney General.
I want to thank the member for the question. This is a very important part of this, this bill, is the definition of community harm. So just to give the history of where it came from, the Human Rights Commissioner did a report called the Grandmother Report, and that definition set out a definition of a term, community harm, and we adopted it in the Anti-Racism Data Act legislation, but also it's by reference, as you can see in this one, to that definition. But just to make clear what the definition includes, because I think it's really important, it includes racism, prejudice, stereotyping, bias, stigmatization, or other harms that a group of people might experience. So it's meant to be very broad, to capture anything that we would think of in terms of singling out one group for their qualities over another. So I think I give the list: racism, prejudice, stereotyping, bias, stigmatization. So it's meant to be a very broad definition, and that helps to serve the content of the bill and the powers and how they're used.
Member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So has the Minister Office referenced other jurisdictions that have the same kind of a term as community harm, or just basically based on the Human Rights Commissioner's report?
Attorney General.
No, this is another example in the bill of where we're really leading the way in British Columbia when it comes to systemic racism, because this definition, as far as I know, and our team's aware, is not used anywhere else in the country.
Member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So how does the Minister define systemic racism, and how does this again compare with definition in other jurisdictions?
Attorney General.
Okay, I just want to thank the member again for the question because it helps me explain the approach of this legislation in a holistic way. So there is no definition of systemic racism contained in the bill, and that was deliberate. Because what we heard from our consultations and what we heard, and actually the history of the way the conversations change, is that the discussion is it's not up to government to define the experiences that community members are having. And if you enshrine a definition in legislation, it's slower to change, or the ability to change that with the evolving nature of how community harm is showing up, which is defined, makes it harder to adapt. So instead, what this bill does is set up a process to ensure that government is continually responding to the changing ways that communities are experiencing systemic racism or definitions are changing. So that process shows up in many different ways, but one of them is through the action plan. So when government has to issue an action plan, that would be a place to put definitions that are receptive to the time period and what the community is experiencing at that time. Like one example is with anti-Black racism, like that shows up and changes differently, and the community might be experiencing it differently. So when government is coming up and will have to come up with an action plan, it's the way for us to touch in with community and understand and continually evolve our definitions as they show up for people. So that was kind of a deliberate choice to make sure that the fluidity of definitions can be contained in the work of government and not within legislation. And we will probably get into details about how that shows up at different times with the checks and balances that are built in within the legislation.
Recognizing the member from Vancouver-Langara.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm pleased to join our colleague, Shadow Minister responsible for multiculturalism and anti-racism, and member for Richmond North Centre, and just to join in this committee debate, my schedule permitting as well. I appreciate the Attorney General referred to, Madam Chair, the framework around the development of the action plan that's referred to in Clause 4. And of course, we are reviewing the definitions in Clause 1, which is 6 definitions. We're just getting into an understanding of some of those definitions in respect of community harm, for example, that the member from Richmond North Centre just started into, and there may be other questions to follow on that. But just to appreciate the opportunity to explore, Madam Chair, the scope of this bill. Certainly there's been a discussion today around consultation, which I would like to review as well at some juncture during a break, but in terms of the Attorney General's response. But in terms of the definitions of defined terms, certainly I see the definition of Indigenous peoples and the reference to the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. There is other terms, of course, that are utilized in Clause 4, but even like Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. There is a question that arises in terms of defining peoples. Here we have a definition around Indigenous peoples, but we don't have definitions around other diverse peoples, racialized, ethnocultural, members of other ethnocultural communities in the province. The minister just referred to Black Canadians, and there's no definition there either. So can I ask, through you, Madam Chair, to the Attorney General, why is it that there's only a definition of Indigenous peoples in this Anti-Racism Act?
Attorney General.
Yes, so I talked a little bit about the approach that we took when it came to defining or not defining, and I think there's specific reasons for that I'm sure that we will get into. But the reason for the specific inclusion of Indigenous peoples in there is very clearly because this act This act is about the actions of government in removing systemic racism and the history of colonization on Indigenous people in this province and the systems that were in place within our governments to, in fact, put into place colonization, leaves them in a very particular situation with government response. So that's why when we did our engagement and this actually was part of our commitments under UNDRIP, under the Declaration Act plan, that the specific ask was to have an Indigenous specific racist anti-racism plan because of the work of UNDRIP. So when we did our Indigenous specific engagement, it became very clear what our obligations needed to be under this piece of legislation. So there's a specific need because of that commitment and our work of UNDRIP and the history of the province to include a definition of an Indigenous people and have a specific anti-Indigenous racism plan.
Member.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I just left my own estimates process with the Minister responsible for Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, and we have a member who continues on with that debate in parallel to this chamber. But I certainly recognize that in respect of Indigenous peoples as defined under the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act that was passed with our support in the official opposition, the BC Liberals, now BC United, that there was a process that was followed there, and that, of course, was embedded in other legislation that the government has brought forward over the last 4.5 years, including when the government brought closure on Bill 36 on the Health Professions Act, and I did join my colleague, the member for Prince George Valemount, on that bill, only though we only got a third of the way through that bill before we opposed the bill ultimately, in terms of the implementations of the systemic, dealing with systemic racism against Indigenous peoples in the healthcare system. But of course, Madam Chair, we have other examples of systemic racism in our province, including against people of my descent and the descent of the member for Richmond North Centre, and that, of course, is Chinese Canadians, or Canadians of Chinese descent, who built the railway in this province, who sacrificed their lives to connect that national railway in the late 1800s, literally, who were then discriminated against by so many British Columbians, including members of this chamber, this legislative assembly. And I know when I went to Ottawa a year ago in the summer, in June, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923, that there are clear examples of systemic discrimination, including in this province. And so I recognize certainly, as the Shadow Minister responsible for Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, the importance of defining Indigenous peoples. Because it's only through definition, through the work the government has previously done on the anti-racism data legislation, that defined and started addressing in the sense of tracking data. But there are categories, there is definitions that I would have thought, after all the good work, including by the committee that worked on this bill with government, that there would be definitions in this bill. So just like we have the term Indigenous peoples, and we use terms like Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, did the government consider, for example, just if I take that and the way it's deployed in Clause 4 of this bill, why is it that there isn't other definitions, for example, of Jewish people or Muslim people?
Attorney General.
So the clear, discussion that we had with our deep consultations is that it causes a lot of harm for government to step in the role of defining people and what their race and their background is. You can imagine that if we went through the demographics of British Columbia and sought to define every single group, then not only I think would that be from what we heard, very harmful conversation to some individuals about what definition they fit in under, but I would argue not a helpful exercise for the work that we're doing with this Anti-Racism Act. Instead, the definitions are very broad. So community harm is, and I mentioned this before, the definition of community harm includes racism, prejudice, stereotyping, bias, stigmatization, and other harm to groups of people. So with a definition like that and the tools that are part of the bill, you have the ability to respond to things that communities are facing without government, which I think would be more harmful than not, setting out definitions of which groups should be protected or shouldn't be protected or should be named and shouldn't be named, which I would argue is an exercise that actually works against the spirit of what we're trying to do, which is to remove systemic racism in the province. I will say that we wanted to make it very clear what racism included, because anti-racism is experienced by different communities in different ways. So this is why we put specifically in there Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. We named them because we thought that was a clear need to define that the scope of this legislation includes that. So that's our approach generally when it comes to how we constructed the bill.
Minister, recognizing the hour.
Okay, I move that the committee rise, report progress, and ask leave to sit again.
Members, you've heard the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. This committee stands adjourned.